Welcome. Today we're delving into the annals of the Elder Days. This is an epoch so remote it's really only perceived as legend now. We'll be examining the historical records that tell the story of the Firstborn, a chronicle that starts long before the sun ever rose and whose fate has shaped the very deep history of Middle-earth itself.
You see, the story of the Elves is this profound paradox. It's a story of incredible unity, but also one of tragic, heartbreaking schism. It's really the historical account of a great journey westward, a migration of peoples that would, in the end, sunder them forever. So to really understand this division, we have to look to their very conception, a moment that actually predates the physical world of Arda and begins, not with matter, but with music. To truly comprehend the Firstborn, we have to set aside our conventional ideas of history. Their story doesn't start with stone and soil. It starts with music, with metaphysical design, in a conceptual age before the world was ever given a physical form.
Now, this foundational cosmogony is known to us as the Ainulindalë, which is the music of the Ainur. It was right there, inside this grand celestial symphony, that the world was first envisioned. And it was during the third theme of this music that the coming of the Elves was revealed for the very first time, a theme that, interestingly, was initiated by the creator alone.
And this gave them a completely unique status. The Valar, the great powers who shaped the world, they had no hand in their making. This established the Elves as a brand new, independent variable in the fate of Arda. And that single fact would have just immense consequences for their history.
So, from this timeless music of creation, the chronicle now turns to a specific time and a specific place, the starlit twilight of ancient Middle-earth. This is the stage where the Firstborn would finally emerge into the physical world.
The chronicles state that their awakening was actually preceded by a huge celestial event. Varda, the Lady of the Stars, she undertook what's called a great labor. She gathered the silver dews of Telperion, one of the two trees of Valinor, and from them she forged new and brighter stars. She set these great constellations as signs in the heavens, and it was a direct challenge to the darkness that lay so heavy on the northern parts of the world. So this wasn't just for decoration, it was a preparation, a deliberate kindling of the world for its new inhabitants.
And this account, it records the very moment of their awakening. By the shores of a lake called Cuiviénen, the water of awakening, the Firstborn arose. So their entire collective memory was forged by these first sensations, starlight and the sound of water. This established an elemental bond that would define their arts and their affinities for all time.
And their very first recorded act, it tells you everything about their essential nature. They named themselves the Quendi, which comes from a philological root meaning those that speak with voices. Think about that. In a world they saw as silent, their primary impulse was to create language, to give names to everything they saw. This act of subcreation, of adding to the world through art and speech, that would become absolutely central to their identity.
But this awakening did not go unnoticed. The records are very clear that the dark power Melkor was the first to become aware of them. He sent spirits to spy on them, to ensnare the unwary. And right here we find the first great tragedy. Those who were captured were taken to his fortress of Utumno and, through slow, cruel arts, twisted into the race of Orcs, a mockery of the Firstborn, and their most enduring enemy.
Now the arrival of the Vala Oromë, a great hunter, finally ended their isolation. He brought a summons with him, an invitation to leave Middle-earth and journey west to the blessed realm of Valinor. This summons presented the Quendi with a monumental choice, one that would, without question, sunder their people forever.
And this summons, it prompted the very first, the primary schism. Those who accepted it were named the Eldar, the people of the stars. Those who refused, however, came to be called the Avari, the unwilling. This single choice created a cultural and a geographical division so fundamental that the two groups, they wouldn't meet again for many, many ages.
But even the Eldar themselves, they weren't a single group. They journeyed west in three distinct hosts. First, you had the Vanyar, led by Ingwe, who were masters of song. Then came the Noldor, followers of Finwë, the most skilled in craft and the pursuit of lore. And last, the largest host, the Teleri, who loved the sea and its music above everything else. These affinities, for poetry, for craft, for the sea, these weren't just preferences, they were the very currents that would carry each kindred toward a profoundly different destiny.
So for the rest of our analysis, we're going to focus on the Noldor,
Of all the kindreds, their skill in what they called art, the subcreation of physical things, it was the greatest. And it was this very skill that led to both their greatest achievement and their most terrible downfall.
The absolute pinnacle of Noldoran craft was the Silmarils. They were fashioned by Fëanor, the most gifted of their kind. But you have to understand, these were not just jewels. They were living artifacts that held within them the blended light of the two trees of Valinor, the very light that illuminated the Blessed Realm before there was ever a sun or moon.
But this triumph, it contained the seeds of tragedy. The annals speak of a possessive attitude that overcame their creator, Fëanor, and by extension his people. They fell into a deep, deep error. The love for the object, for the creation itself, it began to outweigh the love for the sacred light it was meant to celebrate. And right there, that's the core of their tragedy. Their greatest virtue, this incredible drive to create beauty, it became corrupted into a possessive greed for the things they had made. This philosophical flaw would become the engine of war, of exile, of ruin, and it would propel the Noldor all the way back to Middle-earth in a hopeless war to reclaim their own creations.
One of the most profound consequences of their rebellion was actually linguistic. After their kinslaying was revealed, their ancient language, Quenya, was forbidden from common use in the realm of Doriath. So the high speech of the West became a symbol of their estrangement, living on only as a language of lore.
The wars for the Silmarils, they defined the First Age, but they also represent the high watermark of elven history in Middle-earth. The ages that followed tell a very different story, one of a slow, lingering decline, a withdrawal from the world. This timeline really shows the long arc of their history. You have the great wars of the First Age. Then they establish new realms in the Second. But by the Third Age, the last of the High Elves begin their final departure from the Grey Havens, really ceding the dominion of the world to men. And in the later ages, they become a reclusive people, just a shadow, a memory of a time that had long passed. And so, the historical record leaves us with this final, lingering question. The entire chronicle of the Firstborn is one of light, celestial light, the captured light of jewels, and then finally, just the light of their memory in a world they have now forsaken. Their enduring legacy, therefore, is one of both beauty and sorrow, a profound echo from a world that is no longer.
The great annals of Arda present us with a very clear cosmological order, a grand design for its speaking peoples. And yet, within these same ancient records, we find a singular, truly remarkable deviation. We're going to conduct a historical examination of a people whose very existence began as an act outside the great music, a kindred known to the Elves as the Naugrim, but to themselves as the Khazad.
These words, recorded as having been spoken by the supreme authority, Ilúvatar, are the absolute fulcrum upon which an act of incredible presumption was transformed into the genesis of an entire race. You see, this isn't just a pardon, it's a divine sanction. It's an act of adoption that literally wrote a new people into the fabric of the world. The circumstances that led to this moment, well, they demand a much closer look.
To truly understand the Naugrim, we have to start with their metaphysical origins. They weren't conceived in that great celestial harmony that brought forth the Firstborn or the followers. No, their beginning is a tale of a secret, fervent act of subcreation, born from the impatience of one of the divine powers.
Now, when we examine Aulë's motivation, it's clear it wasn't born of malice. There was no desire for dominion here. The records are quite specific. He was moved by this overwhelming, impatient yearning to have learners, to have beings he could pass his immense knowledge of craft and substance onto. He just couldn't bear the long wait for the children who were prophesied in the music, and so, in a hidden hall, deep under the mountains of Middle-earth, he took matters into his own hands.
This term you see here, the children of adoption, it's not merely a poetic phrase. It is a precise ontological classification. It signifies that the dwarves stand apart. They weren't part of the world's initial blueprint, but they were accepted into it. They were granted the secret fire, true independent life after the fact. And this unique status, well, it defines their entire history and their relationship with every other people of Arda.
The critical moment here is one of profound drama. When Aulë is confronted by Ilúvatar, he repents his presumption and offers to destroy his own creations. He raises his great hammer, but then the very figures he made, they cower, they flinch, and they beg for mercy. And in that single reflexive act of fear, They proved they were no longer just puppets of his will. They had a life of their own. And Ilúvatar, seeing this, gave them their place in the world.
So from this unique ontological foundation, we can turn to their physical being. Aulë's design was anything but arbitrary. He fashioned his children knowing they would awaken to a world that was already living under the shadow of Melkor. Their very biology, their temperament, it was all a calculated response to the harsh realities of a marred Arda.
These traits are, in essence, proactive adaptations for survival. Their stone-hard constitution was made to endure incredible physical trauma. Their resistance to toil, to hunger, to hurt, it was engineered to be greater than that of any other speaking people. Their spirit, so stubborn, so unyielding, fast in both friendship and enmity, was really a psychological fortress against the deceptions of the shadow. And their long lives, well, that wasn't immortality, but it was a practical necessity, allowing for the multi-generational mastery of their deep and intricate crafts.
A philological analysis of the names they carry is deeply revealing. Their name for themselves, in their own ancient and secret tongue of Khazad-dûm, is Khazad. But the name we often find in the Elven annals is Naugrim, which is what we call an exonym, meaning stunted people. This linguistic split immediately highlights the perceptual gap between these two kindreds, one seeing themselves simply as the dwarves, while the other defined them by their physical stature.
Their awakening and their subsequent dispersal across the world followed a divinely ordained pattern. From those initial 7 progenitors that Aulë fashioned, a vast and disparate people would arise, founding great subterranean cities that would become legends in their own right.
But they didn't wake up right away. A crucial divine mandate was placed upon them, a long, dreamless sleep under stone. So why? Why the delay? It was to preserve the primacy of Ilúvatar's own creations, the Elves. The children of adoption could not precede the children of choice, and so they waited, separated in far-flung, hidden places, until the stars had been kindled and the Firstborn had finally awoken by the waters of Cuiviénen.
As you can see from this archival map, the awakening was geographically widespread. From the arid Luen, the Blue Mountains in the west, arose the fathers of the houses that would go on to found the great cities of Nagrod and Belagost. But far to the east, beneath the misty mountains, awoke the most renowned of their entire line, Durin, the one who had established the greatest of all their mansions, the mighty Khazad-dûm. This ontological divide is probably best understood through a direct comparison. The children of choice, that's the elves and men, they originate directly from the thought of Ilúvatar. But the children of adoption, the dwarves, they come from the hands of Aulë. This creates a very different relationship with the divine powers. Elves and men are almost like younger siblings to the Valar, whereas the dwarves view Aulë with the direct reverence of children for their own father. And as you can see, their ultimate destinies diverge completely, a point we'll return to.
Now, the historical record isn't monolithic. It's not that simple. It also speaks of the lesser branch, the Petty-Dwarves, or the Noigi Naiben. These were a banished people who had wandered into Beleriand long before their grander cousins ever awoke in the Blue Mountains. They were diminished in stature and craft, and they lived these very stealthy lives, harboring a deep resentment for both Orcs and Elves, who they accused of stealing their lands and ancient homes.
The emergence of the Naugrim, you have to understand, introduced a powerful new force into the ecology of Arda. Their inherent drive for industry, for delving and for shaping the earth immediately set them on a collision course with the Vala, whose domain was the natural growing world, Yavanna.
The annals actually call this the Long Grief, and it represents a foundational ideological conflict. Upon learning of Aulë's children, Yavanna, the giver of fruits, was filled with a sense of foreboding. Her concern was for the Olvar and the Kelvar, the plants and the animals. She feared what a race of smiths and miners, with their axes and their furnaces, would do to her creations.
Yavanna foresaw that the dwarves would have, in her words, little love for growing things, and that they would fell trees without pity. Aulë, for his part, didn't deny this. He simply stated a practical truth. Nonetheless, they will have need of wood. This exchange, right here, it establishes an enduring tension, the needs of industry versus the preservation of the organic world that would define the relationship between dwarves and much of Arda for ages to come.
And this brings us, finally, to the ultimate fate of the Naugrim, their eschatology. What is their destiny after death? Their belief system is as unique as their origin, and it is tied directly, inextricably, to their maker, Aulë.
For a very long time, the Elves held a certain belief. They thought that when dwarves died, their spirits simply returned to the stone from which they were made. This, however, is a historical misconception. The dwarven tradition itself, as it was declared to their fathers long ago, speaks of a very different and, frankly, a far grander fate.
So, upon death, a dwarven spirit undergoes a specific process. First, their souls are gathered by Aulë, whom they call Mahal, the Maker. He brings them to special halls set apart just for them in the great waiting place Amandos. And there, they don't fade or depart forever. They wait. They wait for the end, for the last battle, after which their ultimate purpose will finally be revealed, to aid their own maker, Aulë, in the great and final work of remaking Arda anew.
Underpinning their incredible cultural endurance, their resilience through the ages, is this deeply held belief that the Seven Fathers don't truly die. Instead, they are reborn, through the ages in their own houses, bearing their ancient names. The most famous of these, of course, is Doran, called the Deathless, who is said to have returned again and again to lead his people at Khazad-dûm, a living embodiment of the unyielding, unbroken continuity of his kindred.
And so this leaves us with a final provocative question. Here is a people made in secret, born of impatience, adopted into the world, and designed specifically for hardship. Their destiny is not to fade, not to depart, but to take up their tools at the end of all things and help rebuild creation itself. Theirs is a history written in stone and steel, a testament to endurance and a promise of a final great work yet to come.
An Ents? What's that? You know, that's a question you find buried in old records, almost like a footnote from a chance encounter. But it's a question that, when you pull on it, opens a door into a past so deep it feels like myth. It's like discovering an archive to a world way, way older than our own. And today, well, we're going to dive in and find the answer. So to really get a handle on what an Ent is, we can't just look up a definition. No, we have to go on a bit of a historical journey. We've got to peel back the layers of time to an age when the world operated by completely different rules. A time when what we call legends were just, well, they were just facts. So imagine this. In the earliest, primordial ages, the historical accounts describe a world where the woods were just immense, wild, untamed, and inhabited by beings so ancient it's hard to even wrap your head around it. This wasn't just a landscape, you see. It was a living, breathing kingdom. And its first shepherds, its very first guardians, yup, those were the Ents. So right at the dawn of their history, the Ents were, well, they were awakened with a purpose, to serve the forests, to be, as they put it, tree herds. And in those very early days, their society was whole, it was complete. This was the time of the Ents and the Entwives, working together, living as one. But right here, we see the start of a fundamental split, a real divergence in how they saw the world. The Ents, they loved the big, wild stuff. The ancient trees, the untamed woods, the high hills, that was their domain. But the Entwives, their minds were drawn to different things. They desired order, peace. They wanted to cultivate, to tend to smaller trees and gardens, to make things grow in an orderly way. And this difference in heart and purpose, it led to a great sundering. Now, this wasn't a war or some bitter conflict. It was more of a sad separation, really, born from two different callings. The Entwives eventually decided to journey away from those deep, wild forests to find lands where they could create and cultivate on their own terms. You can actually trace their migration in the old archival maps. They crossed the Great River, the Anduin, and on the other side they established these incredible gardens. For a time, everything blossomed. Their lands flourished. But as the miles between them grew, so did the distance in their hearts and minds. They were becoming two separate peoples, not just geographically, but culturally. And that separation, well, it would prove to be absolutely catastrophic. Because the personal story of the Ents is about to get tangled up in a massive, world-changing historical event. Tragically, the beautiful gardens of the Entwives lay directly in the path of a devastating war. This is a direct quote from the record. It's a first-hand account from the Ents themselves, and it's just chilling. We crossed over Anduin and came to their land, but we found a desert. It was all burned and uprooted, for war had passed over it. Can you imagine? They went looking for their kin, for those beautiful gardens, and found nothing, just a wasteland totally destroyed.
And what's incredible is that through historical analysis, we can actually pinpoint when this happened. The disappearance of the Entwives isn't just a myth, it's a dated casualty of a specific conflict, the Great War between Sauron and the Men of the Sea. This all came to a head with the Akelabeth, the absolute cataclysmic downfall of the island kingdom of Númenor. And in the fallout, the lands of the Entwives were scorched into a permanent wasteland, what we now know as the Brownlands. And that's the true scale of this tragedy. Think about it. An entire people, a whole culture, just gone. Wiped from the historical record in the shadow of a falling empire. They were, in the harshest terms, collateral damage. And that profound loss, that sorrow, would haunt the surviving Ents for millennia.
So, after this devastating loss, what was left for the Ents to do? They retreated. They pulled back, deep into their forests, like Fangorn, and essentially turned their backs on the rapidly changing world of men and elves. They became figures of legend, almost myths themselves, the long, slow living memory of the ancient world. So what are these shepherds of the trees actually like? Well, for one thing, they're as different from each other as the trees they guard. You might see one that looks like an old oak, another like a slender birch. They are, quite literally, living history. And that slow, thoughtful way they have about them, that's not a flaw. It's because they are archives, living libraries with memories that stretch all the way back to the beginning. Everything they do is patient, steady, and deliberate. And nothing shows this better than their language. Entish is, well, the best word for it is unhasty. It's tonal, it's descriptive, and it takes a very long time to say anything. Why? Because to them, the true name of a thing is its entire life story. Now, think about that compared to, say, Quenya, the language of the Elves. That's a structured language built for lore and song. It just goes to show you, these are two completely different ways of seeing and experiencing the world. Now, over these immense stretches of time, something else started to happen. Some Ents began to get more and more, well, tree-ish. They became what are known as horns, silent, watchful, and much closer to being actual trees than people. But don't be fooled. They hold on to a deep, dangerous power, and they can move with truly terrifying speed when they're roused to anger. There's a quote in the records that really puts it best. Someone noted that the horns are queer and wild, dangerous. I should be terrified of meeting them if there were no true Ents about to look after them. It's like a warning, right? The horns are the wild, primal heart of the forest, and it kind of reinforces why the true Ents are so important. They're the shepherds, keeping that raw, dangerous power in check. So for age after age, the Ents just endured. They were content to be a memory, a story whispered in the deep woods. But then a pivotal event, a final straw, was about to happen. The reckless, thoughtless destruction by a nearby enemy finally managed to do the impossible. It woke up the slow, deep, and absolutely terrible anger of the forest. But of course, this awakening wasn't some rash, sudden thing. Not for the Ents. It started with an Ent moot, an ancient council, and it took 3 days for them to reach a decision. You have to picture this long, slow, chanting debate in their ancient tongue where millennia of sorrow and patience finally boiled over into action. The decision was made. The shepherds of the trees were going to war. And what happened next is one of the most stunning events recorded in the history of that age. It's written that the trees of Fangorn were awake, and the forest was rising, marching over the hills to war. Just imagine that sight. A force of nature that had been patient for thousands upon thousands of years was now, at last, unstoppably unleashed on the world. So we come all the way back to that first question. An Ent? What's that? Well, now we know. It's a shepherd. It's a living archive. It's a force of nature fueled by a sorrow as deep as its oldest roots. But their whole story, this incredible history, leaves us with one last big question to chew on. What does it really take for a power that has slept through entire ages of the world to finally awaken? Today, we're going to explore one of the most profound and frankly one of the most tragic chronicles in the entire history of Arda, the story of men. We know them as the followers, the second-born, the ones who would ultimately inherit a world that was shaped by powers they didn't always understand. And their destiny, well, that remains even now a thing largely unwritten. Our story is going to start not at their beginning, but at their absolute peak and their catastrophic fall from it. The historical record is just stark. It's crystal clear. In a single geological event of almost unimaginable violence, the great star-shaped island of Númenor, you can think of it as the kind of Atlantis, really, the absolute pinnacle of human achievement, was just annihilated. And this wasn't simply an earthquake or a flood. The world itself was fundamentally broken and remade, seemingly just to erase this kingdom from its face. Now, the lore masters, they don't call this a simple disaster. They have a very specific term for it, the second fall of man. And that name implies a deep spiritual precedent. You see, humanity had already fallen once, way back in its shrouded prehistory, when they fell under the sway of the enemy. The Númenorians, they represented a second chance. They were a people exalted. Their lifespans tripled, granted wisdom and glory beyond all others. And yet, they fell again. And that really poses the central question for us, doesn't it? How did a people who were so blessed, so advanced, so powerful, manage to engineer their own complete and utter destruction? To answer that, you really have to go back to the very blueprint of their creation. You see, the origins of men are metaphysically completely distinct from every other being in Arda. Their conception wasn't a shared project among the Valar, the great powers who shaped the world. No, it was a solitary act of the creator, Ilúvatar, a secret theme woven into what's known as the great music of creation. And the implication of this, well, it's profound. Because men came directly from the mind of the creator, they were always seen as strange and free. They were this unpredictable variable, even to the powers themselves. Their fate wasn't entirely contained within the music that served as destiny for everything else. This made them agents of incredible change, but also of incredible unquiet. And right here is where you see the core difference between the two great kindreds. The elves, they're bound to the world. Their immortality is this long, slow fading that's tied to Arda itself. But men are different. They're guests. Their great gift is a freedom from the world, an escape from its long, wearying ages. So, the crucial point to understand is this. Mortality was never meant to be a curse. It was called the gift of men, a unique and, in some ways, an enviable freedom. The entire tragedy of human history is how this gift, this hope of departure, was twisted by fear and by pride into a doom they would do anything to escape. This metaphysical beginning has an echo in their physical one. The first men, the Atani, they didn't wake up in the light. They woke up in a deep twilight, way in the eastern parts of Middle-earth, and they were under the immediate influence of the first great enemy. This timeline really charts their earliest, most formative struggles. They were born into shadow, and many were immediately enslaved by the enemy, who right away began the long work of corrupting their gift into a terror of death. But some repented. They heard whispers, rumors of a great light in the west, and so they began this incredible westward migration, which all culminated in their arrival in Beleriand and that legendary alliance with the Elf Lords. You could imagine the elves, who had been alone in the world for ages, they struggled to understand this new race. And you can see their confusion, maybe even their apprehension, in all the names they came up with. They range from the neutral, the followers or the afterborn, to the much more telling ones, like the usurpers, the strangers, and even the self-cursed. It really speaks to this deep sense of otherness. So those who actually completed that journey west became known as the Edain, the fathers of men, and they were mostly divided into three great houses, each with really distinct cultural and physical traits. You had the House of Beor, who were most like the lore-master elves. Then there was the mighty, warlike House of Hodor, and finally the hardy, more solitary people of Haleth. They were all contrasted by the Easterlings, a different stock of men who came later and whose loyalties, well, their loyalties were often divided. And so we come back to Númenor. Because for all their valor and faithfulness in the Great Wars, the Edain were given this incredible island kingdom as a reward. They were raised up, granted wisdom, and given lives far, far longer than any other mortals. But this great reward, it carried within it the very seed of their undoing. Their lives were extended to a triple span, sometimes even more. And this immense longevity, it was meant to give them time to perfect their arts and their wisdom. But what it did instead was give them more time to think about its end, more time to resent the one thing they couldn't have, immortality. And the decay wasn't sudden. It was this slow, creeping rot that unfolded over centuries. It all started with jealousy, this resentment of their own gift. And that morphed into this morbid obsession with preservation, building these vast, silent tombs to try and defy death.
That pride led them to openly rebel against the Valar's one single rule, that they never sail west to the Undying Lands. And finally, all that pride curdled into darkness, and the ultimate act of hubris, launching an invasion of paradise itself.
The philosophical idea behind this whole decline is what the lore masters call the machine. Now, this isn't just about technology, it's a whole mindset. It's the impulse to dominate reality through external force, instead of achieving mastery through your own internal growth. And this impulse, it found its ultimate expression in their obsession with death, building these massive stone tombs, practicing arts of preservation, all in this futile attempt to embalm life and control their own mortality. The Númenóreans became the ultimate masters of the machine, and in the end, it just consumed them.
The consequence of their rebellion was absolute. The Creator intervened directly. The flat world was broken, bent into a sphere. And the undying lands of the West were removed from the physical circles of the world entirely, now only accessible by a straight path that was reserved for the elves. For men, paradise was now truly and forever out of reach.
But not all of them were lost. A small group, the faithful, they had held true to the old ways. And as the island sank beneath the waves, they fled the deluge, carrying with them the seeds of Númenor's true legacy. This survival story, led by the great chieftain Elendil and his sons, it's almost mythical. They managed to establish new kingdoms in Middle-earth, Arnor up in the north and Gondor in the south. And these realms in exile, they became the new bastions of light and lore in a world that was very quickly falling back into darkness. Their first great act was to forge one last epic alliance with the Elves to confront the enemy, Sauron, who had actually orchestrated Númenor's fall in the first place. This was it. This was the last time the two kindreds would ever march to war as equals. A heroic, but ultimately tragic end to an entire epic. And they were victorious. The enemy was overthrown. But right there, in that moment of absolute triumph, came a disastrous mistake. Elendil's son, Isildur, took the enemy's ring of power for himself. He saw it as a weregild, a blood price for his father and brother who had been killed in the war. But by failing to destroy it, he allowed the very essence of the enemy to endure.
Isildur's failure, that single choice, ushered in the Third Age, what some chroniclers call the Twilight Age, or a medium aevum, a kind of Middle Age. It marked the true beginning of the dominion of men. The elves began to fade from the world, and the full weight of Arda's future fell squarely on the shoulders of the Secondborn, with all of their frailties and all of their potential.
So when you look back on this vast historical panorama, all the way from their secret conception to the dawn of their own age, certain fundamental truths about the nature of humanity, they just become clear. It really boils down to three truths. First, their gift of freedom, this unique ability to act as the ultimate agents of change in the world. Second, the terrible burden that comes with that freedom when you're faced with mortality, which so often leads down that prideful path of the machine. And finally, this dual capacity for both unparalleled heroism and just catastrophic failure, a cycle that seems to define their entire history.
And this brings us to what might be the most provocative and mysterious prophecy in all the lore. It's said that the ultimate purpose of men, their still unwritten destiny, is to participate in the very end of all things. That in the final remaking of the world, their free voices will join the music of the Ainur, and at long last, the great themes of creation will finally be played aright. A destiny that, for now, is still unfolding.
Today, our historical inquiry turns to one of the most enigmatic peoples of Middle-earth. They are an ancient race, yet if you look for them in the Great Chronicles, you'll find an almost total silence. We are speaking, of course, of the small folk, whose quiet lives have, somehow, against all expectation, ended up shaping the very course of history itself.
You know, this passage from the Red Book of Westmark really gives us the most essential summary of their character, and the key word there is unobtrusive. This wasn't just a simple preference for them, it was a deeply ingrained trait, almost an inherited art of going unnoticed. They truly cultivated an ability to be overlooked, to blend into the very earth they loved so much, which, as you can imagine, presents a unique challenge for any historian.
And this is where we encounter the central paradox of our study. The Elven records, which are so meticulous in detailing the grand cosmological events of the Elder Days, make no mention of them.
None whatsoever. So how can a people so ancient remain so completely absent from the annals? It's a silence that is so profound, it practically demands an investigation.
Now, before we proceed any further, we really must establish the correct terminology. You see, the Eldar, when they eventually did become aware of this kindred, gave them a name in the Sundering tongue, the Perianath. It simply means the halflings, and this designation is absolutely key to placing them within the known genealogies of Middle-earth.
So, this brings us to our first real line of inquiry, their lineage. Where exactly do the Ents fit within the great family of the speaking peoples? Well, all of the surviving historical and linguistic evidence points in one very clear direction.
The origin of the Perianath is, as it turns out, inseparable from that of the Atani. This is the High Elven term for the race of men, the second people, so called because they awoke in the world after the Elves. Their other designation, the followers, speaks to their destiny, to follow the path of the Firstborn into the world.
The connection, therefore, is quite clear. Despite becoming estranged over the long ages, the Perianath are, in fact, a diminutive branch of the Atani. The linguistic evidence alone is pretty much irrefutable. In the old days, they spoke the languages of men, albeit in their own fashion, and their foundational patterns of life were very much the same.
And these shared traits are absolutely fundamental. Their preference for simple tools over complex machinery, for instance, and their inherent toughness. These are hallmarks of the early kindreds of men. Their famous elusiveness, however, that appears to be a specialized adaptation, something honed over countless centuries of living quietly in a world that was, for the most part, dominated by their taller kin.
All right, so with their general lineage established, we can now proceed to a more detailed ethnographic survey. The ancient records speak of 3 distinct breeds, and their unique characteristics were already well-defined long before their great migrations into the westlands of Eriador.
The first of these breeds were the Harfoots. They were, by far, the most numerous, and are generally considered the most representative variety of hobbit kind. What's of note here is their ancient association with dwarves, and their strong preference for highlands. This group, more than any other, preserved the ancestral habit of living in tunnels, or smiles, as they were called in their own dialect.
Next, you have the Stors. Physically, they were quite distinct, much broader, heavier in build, with notably larger hands and feet. Genealogically, they're interesting for a couple of reasons. First, they were far more comfortable with the proximity of men, and second, some of their males could actually grow a faint down on their chins, a trait that's entirely absent in the other 2 breeds.
And finally, we have the Followhides. They were the least numerous of the 3, but were disproportionately influential. They were fairer, taller, and more adventurous than their kin, and they were also more friendly with the elves and skilled in language and song. It's from this particular strain that many of the great chieftains and leaders among the other clans would later arise.
But, physical and cultural anthropology can only take us so far. It doesn't provide the complete picture. To truly understand the nature of the Perianath, we have to turn from the historical record to the cosmological one, to the very music of creation itself.
And so we are faced with this fundamental question. Their quiet, unobtrusive nature, their complete absence from the great tales, is this just an accident of history, or does it point to something far, far deeper? Whence did this secret life truly arise?
Well, the archaic annals of the Ainulindalë, the music of the Ainur, seem to provide an answer. You see, while the first 2 themes of the great music were woven by the Valor, the great powers who shaped the world, the third theme was a solitary act of the creator, Ilúvatar. And it was within this specific, unheralded melody that the followers, the race of men, were first conceived.
And herein lies their unique ontological status. The coming of men was, itself, a design held solely in the mind of the One. It was an intrusion of the secret fire, the very flame of creation that actually bypassed the Valar. The Perianath, then, as an overlooked branch of men, represent the most profound secret life in all of creation. They are a secret hidden even within the Creator's initial secret.
And the implication of this is just staggering. Because the Valar, the governors of Arda, had no part in their specific devising, the Perianath remain strange and free from the foresight of even the most powerful spirits. They operate on a level that seems to defy the grand, preordained patterns of the world.
So now, we can bring these 2 threads of evidence together. How does their secret metaphysical origin explain their peculiar character and, well, their ultimate place in the history of Middle-earth?
You see, their lack of a grand recorded history isn't an oversight. It is the direct result of their nature. They are, fundamentally,
unpredictable. Their path isn't set within the deeps of time in the same way as that of elves or even the great lords of men, and this freedom from prediction is in fact their greatest strength.
And so we're left with this final, profound thought. While the great and the powerful move in accordance with the grand themes of the music, these smaller folk seem to possess a virtue to shape their lives beyond it. Their stories suggest that sometimes the most profound changes aren't orchestrated by the great powers at all, but by those whose very existence is a quiet, unexpected, and utterly free note in the great song of creation.
From the deepest reaches of the Elder Days, we survey a lost epic, an age preserved for us only in the most ancient of chronicles. This is a historical account, a look at the primal cities and fortresses that really defined a world that has long, long since passed away.
Our records begin in a time before the great cataclysms. You see, before the world was broken and the very seas were shifted. This is a history of that first world, its rise, and ultimately, its ruin.
So, where do we begin our account? Well, it has to be with the earliest recorded age. This was an era of, believe it or not, unparalleled harmony and a near-perfect geographical design, known to the chroniclers as the Spring of Arda.
Now, this period, though it was tragically brief, is of immense historical importance. You have to think of it as a baseline of primordial order, a time of unmarred perfection. All subsequent history, really, must be understood as a deviation from this perfect state. The Isle of Almarin, which was established right in the midmost parts of the earth, was so much more than the world's first capital. It was the physical embodiment of a philosophical ideal, a borderless center for a unified, ordered world. This was at a time when, as the records say, new-made green was yet a marvel.
So the destruction of Almarin by this northern shadow, it wasn't just a military defeat, not at all. It was a cataclysm that physically and ideologically reshaped the entire world. The shattering of this symmetry, it ended the dream of a global civilization, and it forced a strategic retreat to a fortified, almost isolationist realm in the distant west.
Following the loss of the world's center, the historical focus, it shifts. It shifts to a new pivotal point. The emergence of the Firstborn out in the vast, untamed East, and the immediate schism that would come to define their entire age.
The Annals of the Wise of Erisea, they place this location, Cuiviénen, or the Water of Awakening, as a starlit mirror in the East. And its significance, well, it just can't be overstated. It was right here that the Firstborn, the Quendi, awoke and first beheld the stars, beginning their great work of subcreation through the formulation of speech and, of course, the naming of the world.
And this is where we find the core philosophical conflict of the age. On one side, you have the Quendi, the people of the stars, who were engaged in the art of subcreation. And then, in direct opposition, stood the Orcs, who were not a naturally arisen people, but a product of the cold application of the machine, engineered to be the vilest mockery of the Firstborn. You know, the first great division among the Firstborn wasn't one of conquest, it was one of choice. Faced with a summons to journey into the west, they were sundered. The Eldar, they undertook the journey. The Avari, the unwilling, they refused the call. This was a schism born from fear and persuasion at the very, very dawn of their history. Now, this decision, it initiated one of the greatest migrations in the entire historical record. The journey of the Eldar moving westwards was a defining movement. It would shape cultures, it would sunder peoples, and it would give birth to new languages all across that vast twilight continent. It's truly difficult to comprehend the sheer scale of this trek. I mean, this was a journey of ages, undertaken across the leagues of a Middle-earth still shadowed by these northern evils and lit only by starlight. It's an incredible testament to the perseverance and resolve of these early peoples. And of course, a direct, lasting consequence of this migration was linguistic. Philologists can trace a very clear divergence. You have Quenya, the High Eldarn tongue, which was preserved in the Blessed Realm, becoming a language of lore. And at the same time, Sundering became the living, evolving tongue of those who remained behind in the lands of Beleriand. Okay, now we have to turn our attention to the great antithesis of the Eldarn realms. Because in the cold shadows of the north, a much darker design had been festering, and it culminated in the creation of a vast fortress citadel, a monument to domination and the machine. The chronicles describe a a truly horrifying landscape. The three peaks of Thangagordrum rose over a wasteland of gray ash, the sky itself crowned with the smoke of deep furnaces. You see, this wasn't just a fortress, it was an industrial hellscape, a direct physical and ideological assault on the natural world. The annals preserve this one account from the period that really serves as a microcosm for the entire struggle, the last High King's defiance at the very gates of the citadel. The record describes him as a tiny, glowing spark charging into the mouth of a literal hell, pitting the will of a champion of art against the Lord of the Machine. The duel was one of immense disparity. Although the king possessed superhuman speed, the adversary's sheer power was, well, it was overwhelming. The turning point is recorded so starkly. Morgoth's shadow looms over him like a falling mountain. But, and this is crucial, that defiance was not without cost to the Dark Power. With his dying breath, the king inflicted an eternal wound. The adversary limped back into the darkness, as the text says, his face forever broken, never to walk the earth again. A mortal blow for the king, yes, but an eternal scar for the Lord of Slaves. The echoes of this conflict between art and machine would reverberate through the ages, culminating in a later but related epic, the history of the great island kingdom of Númenor. It's presented not as some slow decline, but as a catastrophic archaeological and geological event, a downfall recorded in both historical texts and in the very strata of the earth. When you look at the timeline, the trajectory of this civilization is it's a clear, tragic arc. It all begins with an age of friendship with the Eldar, but that gives way to a rebellion born of pride and fear. Then the shadow falls, as the teachings of the Dark Servant Sauron corrupt the kingdom, which leads to the construction of a great armament and culminates in the breaking of the world itself. The sheer finality of this event is it's captured in this one stark pronouncement from the historical record. For it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness, and is no more. It just speaks of a complete and total destruction. So you see, these events were not isolated, not at all. Their consequences were permanent and planetary. So we'll conclude now by reflecting on the profound changes that were wrought upon the physical world and upon the very nature of history itself. The world after these cataclysms was fundamentally diminished. The chronicles are very clear on this. The very fashion of the world was changed. The deathless lands were removed from the physical circles of the world. New lands and new seas were made. And perhaps most poignantly, the memory of a time without evil was lost forever. And this leaves us with a profound question, one for any student of these deep histories. When a civilization is drowned by the sea, when its memory becomes myth and its highest ideals are removed beyond the reach of mortals, what is left for its inheritors but a world of echoes?